Alright, welcome back. So here we are finally with the Mighty Endeavor First Edition, published in 2005 by Multiman Publishing and designed by Tim Armstrong and Steve Newhouse. This is part of the Standard Combat series, which is new to me, so should make for an interesting first experience, and judging by the rules, a pretty good one. Now, I should mention that there's been an expanded version that's come out more recently with more maps, one for the Eastern Front, another smaller one for Brittany, I believe, as well as a few changes to existing components and some changes to the rules as well as a significant change to the sequence of play, I think. I don't know how the two compare, I don't know the availability of either, but I'm happy with this, plus it was a gift. But as you can see, I don't have room for much more than one map. It's a criteria I like to use for my gaming purchases regardless. Is it a one map game or smaller? And I might make an exception in the future for a bigger game as long as it comes with a good amount of one map scenarios, because I don't see myself playing anything much bigger than this, at least not solo. Alright, so apologies for the delay. I've been trying to figure out how best to do the intro. I know I promised this sometime over the weekend, but totally missed that target. It's because I actually started filming the intro, and at about the 30-minute mark I realized I was just wrapping up the standard series rules, because I usually like to go over most of the rules, and thinking it was just taking too long. So, similar to what I'm doing with the playthrough videos now, and since I got some positive feedback from the Sinai playthrough with the new method, I think I'll be doing a similarly distilled, shorter intro video here going forward, at least for games of this size or larger. For the smaller games, it's no big deal. So we're going to focus on parts of the rules that I find interesting or that are new to me, that I find challenging. In this case, for the most part, the exclusive rules. And even so, not every single exception or anything like that. I'll save that for the playthrough. But that's the part of the rules that I think are going to be most challenging to get used to. So it'll help to walk through them here with you. And that's kind of what these intro videos are for me anyway. So you might notice that I've placed a dice tray here to block this ugly glare too, just in case you're wondering. We're going to start by just taking a look at the components. Here we have the game set up for the full campaign game. I usually like to start with shorter scenarios, but in this case, you miss out a lot if you don't play the full game, plus the other scenarios are not that much shorter. So we're going to start on turn 1, June 6, 1944, and play 25 turns through the end of April 45. It's going to take me a while to finish this, and it's probably going to take me a while between videos from here on out through the end of the game. So we have our Allied and German reinforcements set up on their turn of entry. Each turn represents about 10 to 15 days. Units for the most part are divisions, and each hex represents a distance of about 15 miles across. And up above here, from my perspective, is the terrain effects chart. We have a track here for Allied airdrops, an Allied air support table, a beach classes chart, informational markers, out-of-supply markers, emergency attack markers. The Germans get a defend the Reich marker. Here are port-related markers, here ground support-related markers. We have an England box and a Mediterranean box where I've set up our starting Allied units, and on the map itself we have our initial German units. The map represents most of France, along with neighboring countries to the east. The German units, for the most part, are along the coast, mostly up here by the English Channel. So the map cuts off on the western edge just west of Cherbourg, Saint-Malo. We have Nantes, some Atlantic coast, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Mediterranean coast, Marseille, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, part of Germany, the Rhine River, parts of Switzerland and Italy represented as well. Here's the combat results table, which has a small misprint here for invasion rules, so we'll be using the one at the back of the rulebook. Let's take a look at the sequence of play. Here's the sequence of play. It's an I-Go-You-Go starting with the Allied player. The general structure is movement, combat, exploitation, supply. Each player also gets a reinforcement and replacement phase, and you see that the allied player has quite a few more phases to resolve as well, including the air point phase, the invasion placement phase, the attack HQ announcement and final unflipping phase, the airdrop phase, as well as the shipping phase. So the allied player is trying to win the game by gathering victory points. And they do so by controlling VP hexes marked by these red triangles. The number in the triangle is the number of victory points that objective hex is worth. The allies control a hex if a supplied allied unit was the last to occupy or pass through the hex. And the Germans are simply trying to prevent the allies from controlling the VP hexes. There are a total of 48 victory points available on the map. The allies win with 34 or more victory points. It's a draw at 25 to 33, otherwise it's a German victory at less than 25 victory points for the allies at the end of the game. And it states here that the historical victory is represented by 41 of the 48 victory points. One thing to note is that almost all of the VP hexes are located outside of France with just a couple of exceptions over in the east at Metz and Strasbourg. They're mostly in Germany, with some in Belgium and the Netherlands. So there's an actual rule called the Goofy Wargamer Stuff Safety Valve designed to encourage the Germans to control more of the map for longer. So if the Allies occupy or cut off from trace supply the 3 hexes of Paris before game turn 8, then the Allies receive an extra 18 victory points awarded to them during the German supply phase. This rule, however, is negated should the Allies create a beach port in any northern coast hex east of the Seine River, and that gives you an idea that the Allies can create a beach port in almost any coastal hex within certain restrictions. Here are some concepts in a nutshell. Generally speaking, the stats printed along the bottom of a counter from left to right represent the unit's attack strength, defense strength, and movement allowance. And the number in the upper right, in a yellow circle, is the number of steps that the unit has remaining. Supplied units with a printed attack strength of 1 or more exert a zone of control into adjacent hexes that it can directly move into during regular movement. HQs and trucks do not exert a zone of control because instead of a printed attack strength, they have a supply range. Units can only attack enemies in their zone of control, so in this game, you cannot attack across unbridged Rhine River or Sea Line hex sites, basically, I think. Let's see. It costs +2 movement points to enter an enemy zone of control. You may move directly from one EZOC to another as long as you have the movement points to pay the +2 movement points each time you enter an EZOC. There's no additional cost to exit. And friendly units do not negate enemy zones of control for purposes of retreating. When you retreat, you must move farther away from the original hex towards a friendly supply source if possible, but you may avoid enemy zones of control in the process, even if that takes you further away from your friendly supply source. Friendly units usually suppress zones of control for supply tracing. There's one exception when it comes to the Germans. There's a special rule presented in the rulebook by a diagram, but I think the general gist is that as long as Defend the Reich has not been declared, which is a one-time thing that I think is usually done towards the end of the game, then friendly German units do not negate enemy zones of control for supply tracing. Here's a look at the combat results table, which is odds-based and resolved rolling 2d6. So one interesting thing right off the bat is the rounding rule in this system. So basically everything that's 0.5 or above rounds up instead of everything rounding down in favor of the defender, as I'm used to. So 14 to 3, for example, is resolved on the 5 to 1. So that is very interesting. And in conjunction with the Fog of War rule, which states that you're not allowed to examine enemy stacks, tricky during solo play, but doable if you have a bad memory like me, should make for less calculative, more instinctual gameplay, maybe less time hunting down odds breaks, less analysis paralysis, or perhaps, depending on the player, more overly cautious gameplay at times where you're opting to target single units instead of unknown stacks, unless you feel you absolutely need to. We'll find out. Anyway, The results are attacker results and defender results in number of step losses and perhaps retreat hexes. And there are certain attacker results that are in brackets, which applies to the German player again. There's a special rule called tactical adeptness that allows the Germans, if they got such a result, to subtract one step loss. So a bracketed A2 result becomes one step loss for the Germans. There's also a reminder down below that Germans defending in a fort can ignore retreat results. They can take the retreat result. If they do, they have to retreat the full number of hexes. And I'll go ahead and add a couple of other things. The stacking limits in the game are 4 units per hex regardless of steps, checked only at the end of the movement phase and at the instant of an overrun combat. Also, there's a no retreat option that allows you to convert any number of retreat hexes into step losses on a one-to-one basis in any combination. Here's a look at the terrain effects charts showing open bocage, forest, city, wetlands, rough, mountain, different types of river, fortification, roads, bridges, etc. One thing to note is that if a hex contains multiple types of terrain, when moving into it, you take into account the terrain that costs the most to enter, and that's in addition to any river or small river bridges you cross. During combat, you take into account the terrain that most benefits the defender. However, fortifications are special. They only benefit defending German units, and they double the defense strength of those units. And that's in addition to the other terrain. So let's say German units are defending at a fortification in a hex containing forest and rough terrain, then you choose either forest or rough. They're both ×2, so it doesn't matter. And then you double it yet again for the fortification. I mentioned overrun combat, which is a combination of movement and combat resolved during the movement phase. Units that conduct an overrun combat are still eligible to participate in an attack during the combat phase of that turn. Anyway, this is when you take a unit or stack that's not in an enemy zone of control. You pay 2 movement points in addition to the movement point cost to move it to a hex adjacent to your target hex. That hex must only cost 2 movement points or less to enter from your hex of arrival, not counting roads, just the other terrain. And then you just basically resolve regular combat using all the modifiers that would normally apply. But if you successfully vacate the target hex, you must advance. And after the combat phase comes the exploitation phase. This is when exploit-capable units that have this yellow bar across the bottom are able to spend their full movement allowance to move, and they may also conduct an overrun combat. So a unit could potentially attack 3 times in a single player turn. I also forgot to mention there's a special type of movement called strategic movement, strat move, that happens during the movement phase. If a unit does not begin in an enemy zone of control, then they may spend double their printed movement allowance to move through hexes that are also free of enemy zones of control, as long as they end their movement in supply. Next comes the supply phase. So the supply status of a side's units are only checked during the owning player's supply phase. So a unit that's found to be in supply remains supplied until the player's next supply phase, regardless of changing circumstances. Similarly, out of supply units remain unsupplied at least until the next supply phase. Units that are out of supply cannot attack, with the exception of emergency attacks, and they move at half their speed and defend at half their strength, and you use the series rounding rule. Out of supply units are no longer exploit capable and do not have a zone of control, and they cannot absorb replacements during the reinforcement replacements phase. They can, however, strat move. That would bring their movement allowance back up to normal. And we'll talk a little bit about German supply now. The German supply sources are any east map edge hex north of hex row 23, and any of these hexes. German units are in supply, this is before Defend the Reich has been declared, if they can trace a path of any length through hexes that they could normally move through.
to a friendly supply source free of allied units or enemy zones of control. Remember, the 180-degree rule states that friendly German units don't negate enemy zones of control for supply, or really for anything. Now, once Defend the Reich has been declared, which is a one-time thing, and once it's played, it remains in effect until the end of the game and cannot be revoked, and it's played during the German replacement phase, then several rules take effect, including German lines of supply cannot be longer than 10 hexes and must end in a hex of Germany to be valid. The hex of Germany must connect a path free of enemy units and enemy zones of control to a supply source hex, and that's secondary trace. Also, the German surrender rule is suspended. Now, I didn't mention that, but if a German unit that has an out-of-supply marker is found to be out of supply again during the subsequent turn, and if they're not in a fortress, and if Defend the Reich has not yet been played, then the unit is destroyed. Okay, sorry, I'm skipping around here. Also, the 180-degree rule no longer applies once Defend the Reich has been declared. Before we talk about Allied supply, since there are no Allied supply sources on the map at the moment, and I'm assuming we don't really know how to get there, I thought it would be best to go back and talk about some of these phases in the Allied player turn that I've been skipping, starting with the air point phase at the beginning of the turn, in which the Allied player rolls on this air support table to determine the number of air points they can spend that turn to do a number of things, including dominating air zones. There are 6 air zones on the map, divided by red lines, and the Allies can spend air points to dominate any or all of these for 1 air point per air zone. And once this happens, you can mark it with one of these. There's a domination side on these markers. And road hexes at that point would cost 1 movement point, not 1/2 for all German units. Air drops can be executed into the zone. Armor and PG units cannot execute strategic movement in a dominated zone, and each supporting air point in an allied attack yields 2 shifts instead of 1. So another thing you can do with your air points is spend them for ground support. So an air point shifts a combat by 2 columns in an attack, regular or overrun, in a dominated air zone, and by 1 column otherwise. So we have markers that show 1 shift, some that show 2 shifts. These cannot be used in the landing attack of an invasion, and only 1 air point can be used in a given combat. But there's one exception. Once per game, the Allied player can announce that an attack will be supported by a carpet bombing. And in this case, the Allied player can use any number of air points to shift the odds. But this can only be used in an attack, never when defending, and never in an overrun. Alright, next is the invasion placement phase. I had to look up the living rules to figure this out, but I think I have it now. So this is when the Allied player attempts to land assault forces on the coast, open up beachheads and shipping lanes to bring in more units. So there are 6 beachport markers available at the beginning of the game. These are one-time use temporary markers that are removed 6 turns after they're placed. So there are these remove markers that you can place on the turn track to remind, as a reminder. And you can create up to 3 beach ports in a given turn. There are certain restrictions printed on the board. For example, up by the Netherlands, you can only create up to 2 invasion hexes and none east of hex 622. Otherwise, you can place these markers on hexes that have a beach class number printed on them. That's a number in a star ranging from 0 to 3. And so for this example, let's say, just because it's in view, we choose this hex 1714. Oh, there's a fortification there. Okay, so this is beach class 1. We look at the beach class chart over here. The assault force size is 1 unit. So grab a beach port marker. And the assault force must be infantry divisions. So we take, I'll just take one at random here and place it with the beach port marker adjacent to the hex. And because the hex is not occupied by a non-airborne allied unit, we must conduct an invasion combat. So we look at the combat results table, and up here This is what's misprinted on the board. So for any hex with a fortress, you roll in the 1 to 2. Wetlands 1 to 1, all other terrain 2 to 1. That's it, regardless of whatever units are in the hex. So you just take a look at the terrain. So this does have fortification, so we're rolling on the 1 to 2. And you apply the results to the attacker and defender. If you survive and you manage to clear the hex, let's say this is destroyed and this is flipped, then you can land your beach port. And then place the remove marker 6 turns after. And looking at the beach class chart, you can see that the follow-on size is 2 units, first turn after 1. So that means that during the shipping phase of this turn, you can bring in 2 more units, but there's a note down here that states that armor costs 2 units each from the above if more than 1 unit can be shipped. And yes, more than 1 unit can follow on to these beach class 1 hexes. And then in the shipping phase of the next turn, we can bring yet another unit, and that includes HQs and trucks, which count as units for shipping but not for stacking. And the international cooperation rules are in effect during the invasion. So actually, I jumped the gun. The invasion placement phase is when you would just first place the beachport marker and your assault force in a hex adjacent to your target hex. And you actually resolve the invasion combat during the combat phase. And that can be in any order. You can resolve regular combat, say against that same hex, before rolling for the invasion combat. Okay, so now I think we'll skip over Allied HQ announcement and the airdrop phase, and go ahead and talk a little bit about Allied supply. The Allied supply sources are any friendly controlled port. So that can be a real port printed on the board or a beach port. And real ports can either be non-functional or functional, but either way they can provide for trace supply. So during the supply phase, Allied units are considered to be in trace supply if they are within the supply range of a friendly HQ, which can in turn trace supply back to a supply source. Or if they are on or adjacent to a friendly supply source, or if they are at or within 5 movement points of a truck that can itself trace to a supply source. Okay, so there are 3 Allied HQs, US, UK, Canadian, and these all have a supply range of 5 movement points, and these must be able to trace a supply path of 5 movement points or less back to a supply source, a friendly controlled port that's either free of enemy units or unnegated enemy zones of control. And then they bring supply forward to friendly units that are within 5 movement points of the HQ. And for trucks, it works similarly, but trucks can also be used to extend the supply line to an HQ from a supply source, but not the other way around. So you wouldn't be able to use a truck to extend supply from an HQ out to units. And I think you can chain trucks, any number of trucks within the supply range, 5 movement points each, up to an HQ from a supply source. And yeah, I think we'll have a better understanding of this during the playthrough. Now we'll talk briefly about attack HQs. So after the invasion placement phase is the attack HQ announcement phase. This is when the Allied player can flip any supplied HQs on the board over to their attack side. Here's an example for the US HQ. Has a reduced movement allowance, and any units that are within range, well, any US units in this case, would be able to conduct combat. And it works just like supply with the trucks and everything. And at the end of the Allied player turn is when this would be flipped back. There are some special rules and exceptions when it comes to HQs and trucks, as well as Antwerp, Rotterdam, Boulogne-sur-Mer, that I'm saving for the playthrough.
Let's go ahead and talk about the airdrop phase. So the Allied player begins with 12 airdrops available, and during the airdrop phase, you can spend an airdrop point to place one airborne division from the England or Mediterranean box onto the map. And up to 2 units can land by airdrop in a single hex in one turn. That would be 2 airdrop points. And no more than 3 units can airdrop in a single turn. And you roll a die, and for each airdrop on a 1, the unit loses a step, and if the hex is not open terrain and/or if the hex contains an enemy unit or enemy zone of control, the unit loses a step on a 1 or a 2, otherwise the unit lands intact. Airdrops can only be made, again, within a dominated air zone, in any hex, even those occupied by German units, only into any open or bocage hex, cannot be made into city, wetlands, rough, mountain, or forest, or any prohibited terrain hexes. If an airdrop is made onto an enemy unit, you make the normal success roll during the airdrop phase. The airborne unit must attack the German unit in the combat phase, and the airborne unit attacks at half its strength. And if the attack fails to eliminate the German unit, or fails to cause it to retreat from the hex, the airborne unit is destroyed, and air points cannot be applied to these attacks for ground support. Airdrop units cannot move on the turn they land, but they can attack and advance after combat. Airdrop units ignore supply determination in the supply phase right after they drop. In subsequent turns, they must be supplied like any other unit. Airdrop units can attack the turn they land even without the support of an available attack HQ, like invading assault forces. Next, let's talk about the shipping phase, and to do so, we'll discuss ports a bit more. So, a port, such as this, is captured when an allied unit first enters its hex. At that time, you roll a die to determine when the port becomes functional. You place the corresponding port marker on that turn. Number of turns in advance equal to the die roll. And remember that non-functional real ports still act as friendly supply sources for the allied player, but each beach or functional real port allows the shipping of 1 unit each turn, plus any number of direct shipments assigned to that port. Those are reinforcements due to arrive. And all ports have the same shipping rate, and this 1 unit is not in addition to the units allowed due to the beach class invasion cycle. So we have the beach class invasion cycle first, once we create a beach port, and starting on the second turn after, it would go down to or stay at 1 unit per turn plus direct shipments. Shipping to any port along the Atlantic Channel or North Sea coast can only come from the England box. Shipping to any port along the Mediterranean coast can only come from the Mediterranean box, and I think that's pretty much all I want to say about that. Finally, the reinforcement and replacement phase, pretty standard stuff. I actually think all the rules pertaining to it are in the series rulebook. Some things to remember, if I can decipher my notes here. Reinforcements, when they're placed, they can overstack. They're in supply. They can be placed in enemy zones of control. International cooperation is not in effect. When spending replacement points to rebuild units, out-of-supply units cannot absorb replacements. You may rebuild 2 steps at once for 1 replacement point per step. And you see that they are specific to US, Commonwealth, and German units. The US replacement points can be spent on US or French units. Commonwealth points on Commonwealth or Polish units. If you rebuild a dead unit, you place it either in a supplied friendly HQ hex, or if it's an allied unit, in the England or Mediterranean box if it's a German unit, or in any entry hex. Those are the hexes marked with the A's for the Germans, or any Paris hex
if there's a path via roads, not in an enemy zone of control or enemy occupied, to the east map edge. So that ends my intro for the Mighty Endeavor First Edition. It definitely helped clear up a few things. I realized that it is worth it to take a look at the living rules, which I think pertain to the expanded version, because it still does clarify quite a few parts that haven't changed much, just a better explanation, more fleshed out. So I look forward to playing the game. I will take my time with this, so I'm not going to promise anything anytime soon. I'm going to go slowly and check and double check my work as we go. And I think I'll have a good time while I'm doing it. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.